Hey, and welcome to FISM News. I'm Samuel Case.
And I'm Renata Kiss.
And tonight, the House holds Merrick Garland in contempt.
Meanwhile, G7 leaders gather for their annual summit.
And Florida is drenched with record-breaking rainfall. Well, we start with the big news of the day, and that is House Republicans have officially voted to hold Attorney General Merrick Garland in contempt of Congress. Yesterday's resolution passed largely along party lines, passing 216 to 207, with only one Republican voting against it. It comes, of course, as for months now, Garland has refused to hand over audio tapes of President Biden's interview with special counsel Robert Hur about his alleged mishandling of classified documents. Prior to the vote, House Speaker Mike Johnson accused Garland of openly defying Congress.
He is refusing to comply with a lawful subpoena, and that's a problem under Article 1. We have to defend the Constitution. We have to defend the authority of Congress. We can't allow the Department of Justice, an executive branch agency, to hide information from Congress. We have important oversight responsibilities, and that is what is being pursued here.
To recap this whole situation, the special counsel ultimately decided not to charge Biden, saying a jury would likely find him to be a, quote, sympathetic, well-meaning elderly man with a poor memory. Garland has since released a transcript of Biden's interview, but Republicans say that's not going to be enough.
We have a right to know if Robert Hur's recommendation against prosecuting President Biden was warranted. And the best evidence, as Chairman Jordan said, was the audio recordings, because they provide critical insight in what that transcript itself cannot provide. We have to know if the transcript is accurate.
Garland condemned the vote as a partisan weapon. He now, at least theoretically, faces up to a year in prison and $100,000 in fines. But it's highly unlikely the DOJ is going to take a case up against him, even though Trump allies Steve Bannon and Peter Navarro have been prosecuted for the same exact thing. Georgia Republican Marjorie Taylor Greene is calling it a clear double standard.
Well, if Steve Bannon has been prosecuted and is going to prison soon, if Peter Navarro was prosecuted, serving time in prison, is Merrick Garland above the law? I mean, I thought the whole argument is that no one is above the law. And now that we've held him in contempt of Congress, he should be prosecuted by the Department of Justice, and he deserves the exact same fate as Peter Navarro and Steve Bannon.
Garland is now the third AG in American history to be held in contempt of Congress, following Bill Barr in 2019 and Eric Holder in 2012.
Meanwhile, the tables seem to be turning against Trump's prosecutors. This week, America First Legal filed a complaint against Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg and the Biden campaign, saying they violated the Federal Election Campaign Act. AFL alleges that Bragg contributed over $3,300 to Biden, exceeding individual donation limits. Likewise, the Biden campaign did not disclose the alleged contribution, which is also considered a violation. The complaint also said that Bragg hired Biden's ex-DOJ official, Matthew Colangelo, to expedite investigations into Trump. The DOJ denies finding any evidence that Colangelo was hired to go after Trump. Nonetheless, the AFL asserts that Trump's prosecution was a coordinated effort to harm the former president's chances of being reelected. Bragg and Colangelo are set to testify before Congress a day after Trump receives his hush money sentence.
And it looks like the White House is saying that Joe Biden has not entirely ruled out commuting Hunter Biden's sentence after being convicted, that is, on gun charges earlier this week. Biden has already promised he would not pardon his son if convicted. But according to Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre, commuting his sentence is another question.
Not ruling out that he would commute the sentence.
What I'm saying is that the president, I have not spoken to the president about this, and what I'm saying is he was asked about a pardon. He was asked about the trial specifically, and he answered it very clearly, very forthright. As we know, the sentencing hasn't even been scheduled yet. I don't have anything beyond what the president said. He's been very clear about this.
Hunter now faces up to 25 years in prison and fines as high as $750,000, though most legal experts believe he will receive a much lighter sentence as he is a first-time offender.
Meanwhile, the FBI's warning of potential terrorist activity through the southern border crossing gained some traction this week. FISM's Ian Patrick has the coverage for us.
Last week, FBI Director Christopher Wray had once again warned of an increased threat of terror activity filtering through the southern border crisis. And ironically, those comments actually came 1 week before 8 individuals were arrested at the border on suspicion of terrorism. Speaking before the Senate Appropriations Subcommittee on Commerce, Justice, Science, and related agencies, Wray made a request for more FBI funding within the next fiscal year. Wray started his plea by saying that budget cuts could not have come at a worse time for his agency.
And while I very much appreciate this subcommittee's efforts to blunt any cuts, candidly, this could not come at a worse time. When I sat here last year, I walked through how we were already in a heightened threat environment. And since then, we've seen the threat from foreign terrorists rise to a whole nother level after October 7th.
Most of the resulting hearing was a Q&A session between the senators and Director Wray, who was questioned on how more funding would benefit the agency and America in general. But Republican Senator Jerry Moran took special focus on national security at the southern border. In his opening statement, Moran made it clear that he wanted answers on efforts to try and secure our nation amid some troubling reports.
I want to discuss the national security crisis at the southern border. President Biden just signed an executive order to limit claims of asylum for those entering our country. While action by the president is needed, I'm doubtful that this executive order will make the necessary changes to ensure an operational control of our border and that we know who, why, and where people are crossing into our country. Last month, it was reported that a suspected member of ISIS had been freely living in the United States after illegally crossing the southern border. Nonetheless, it would take more than 2 years before that person was arrested on April the 17th. In another case, an individual on the terrorist watch list was summarily released by the Border Patrol after crossing the southern border.
Now, Moran acknowledged the border is mostly under the purview of the Department of Homeland Security, but he does ask if those cases that he had mentioned are reflective of a bigger problem in our intelligence community. Wray responds, saying that the concern rests on more international intelligence gathering rather than gathering done at home.
We have seen over the last 5 to 6 years an increase in the number of known or suspected terrorists, in other words, watch-listed subjects, attempting to cross the border, and that is of concern. The bigger problem, in my view, is twofold. One, individuals who, when they come in, are either armed with fake documents or snuck in some way, or, and this is very important, individuals for whom there's not enough derogatory information in the intelligence community to watch list them yet. As we have less collection overseas against foreign terrorism, there's less sources of information to inform people about people coming in.
And this exact example seems to have surfaced just this week with the arrest of 8 Tajikistani nationals located within the United States. One source said that in their initial border cross screening, none of the individuals had any derogatory information, which would have inevitably placed them on the watch list. And that falls right in line with Director Wray's point of concern. It wasn't until investigators discovered a potential link between these individuals and overseas ISIS members that these 8 Tajikistani nationals were even looked into for ties to terrorism. This is Ian Patrick reporting for FISM News.
Thanks so much, Ian. Meanwhile, anti-Semitic vandals targeted the homes of the Brooklyn Museum's Jewish director as well as several board members on Tuesday night. It was a very disturbing scene. They threw red paint against the doors and walls, writing "blood on your hands." And on top of that, they also painted an inverted red triangle on the door. That actually is a symbol used by Hamas, and it's meant to mark out Israeli military targets. New York Mayor Eric Adams decried the vandalism. He said, quote, "This is a crime and it's overt, unacceptable anti-Semitism." Anti-Israel demonstrators defaced the museum last week, triggering a police crackdown.
And Federal Reserve officials voted yesterday to hold interest rates at a 23-year high and signaled that they expect to decrease rates only once this year. That's fewer than the previous forecast of 3 cuts. On the same day, the Labor Department released its latest consumer price index, which shows that inflation has cooled. There was no increase in May, but prices are up 3.3% from a year ago. However, the core CPI, which does not look at food or energy prices, did see a small 0.2% increase from April to May. Fed Chair Jerome Powell cautioned that there needs to be more similar inflation reports before they loosen monetary policies.
What we've been getting is good progress on inflation with growth at a good level and with a strong labor market. Now, ultimately, we think rates will have to come down to continue to support that. But so far, they haven't had to. And, that's why we were watching so carefully for signs of weakness. We don't really see that. We kind of see what we wanted to see, which was gradual cooling in demand, gradual rebalancing in the labor market while we're continuing to make progress on inflation.
And we'll get into international news when we come back after this break.
Are you new to biblically responsible investing? As Christians, we have the responsibility to be good stewards of the money God has entrusted us with. As we invest in the market, we want to make sure that the companies we invest in aren't taking money and using it to fund industries that grieve the heart of God, like pornography, abortion, gambling, or the LGBT agenda. That doesn't mean a company must be a Christian company to be biblically responsible. It means that company is solely focused on excellence in its industry and doesn't support things that God hates. To learn more about biblically responsible investing and how you can put it to practice in your portfolio, go to financialissues.org.
The mission of Financial Issues is to expose Jesus for all he is, all he means, and all that he can do.
On the day I found I was pregnant, I was full of emotions and I just was so overwhelmed, and I don't know if I'm ready for this huge life-altering, changing commitment. I had individuals around me not wanting me to have this child. And somehow, I was driving and I saw the Women's Help Center sign and I immediately turned in. That just took relief off of me, and I was like, you know what? It's gonna be okay. They gave me the confidence and the support that I needed to be able to go out and face the world. First time I held Finnegan, I just lit up with joy. I was so excited. This little boy that I had in my life, he is loving and generous. Watching him just grow and flourish into this incredible human being has just been so rewarding and so uplifting. Looking back, I don't know what I would do without him, because I needed him more than I think he needed me.
And welcome back to FISM News. I'm Renata Kiss. Well, let's start our international coverage in Italy, where G7 leaders are meeting for a 3-day summit. The summit started today as Western leaders face difficult circumstances back home. The only victorious leader seems to be Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, though her effectiveness with G7 leaders remains doubtful. Nevertheless, the group promised a combined $50 billion aid package to Ukraine from frozen Russian assets. The topics for debate are Ukraine, the Middle East, China, and AI. According to the White House, President Biden will also sign a bilateral security agreement with Ukrainian President Zelensky in a show of strength against Russia. Meanwhile, Pope Francis will also advise countries on the ethics of AI technology. He is the first pope to be invited to a G7 summit.
And in the Middle East, tensions continue to heat up along Israel's northern border. Yesterday, Hezbollah terrorists in Lebanon fired more than 200 rockets into Israel after an Israeli strike killed one of their top commanders earlier in the week.
After the martyrdom of Abu Talib, we will increase our operations in intensity, force, quantity and quality, and let him wait for us in the field.
No one was killed yesterday, but Israel says the size of Hezbollah's attack was, quote, unprecedented. Even amid nearly daily rocket fire since October, Israel is now vowing to respond.
Whether through diplomatic efforts or otherwise, Israel will restore security on our northern border. Israel will respond with force to all aggressions by Hezbollah. Lebanon and Hezbollah, under the guidance of Iran, bear full responsibility to the deterioration of the security situation in the north.
Last week, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said Israel is preparing for a, quote, very strong action in the north, with the IDF's chief of staff saying his forces are ready to attack.
Meanwhile, Russian warships entered the Havana harbor yesterday for a routine military exercise training. A nuclear submarine and a frigate carrying long-range missiles made it to Cuba after conducting a high-precision missile weapons training in the Atlantic. The U.S. closely monitored their actions. The Office of the Secretary of Defense said in a statement, quote, "We are expecting that Russia will temporarily send combat naval vessels to the Caribbean region, and these ships will likely conduct port calls in Cuba and possibly Venezuela." They added that Russia may also deploy aircraft to the region as part of their training, but they would pose no direct threat to the U.S. Nevertheless, Russia is without a doubt flexing its military prowess as tension over Ukraine grows. But there are also maybe other reasons for Cuba's increased friendship with the former Soviet Union. Here's Professor William Leon Grant from the American University explaining that situation.
This geopolitical alignment has echoes of the Cold War, but unlike the first Cold War, the Cubans are drawn to Moscow now not by any ideological affinity, but by economic necessity. Cuba is in a desperate economic situation, and Russia is the only country that has been willing to provide significant help, just as it did during the Soviet era.
And while Cuba is cozying up to Russia, it does appear that North Korea is doing the same thing. As on Tuesday, Kim Jong-un called North Korea an invincible ally of Russia, and it so appears that the feelings are mutual, as Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said of North Korea earlier today. "It is our neighbor. It is a friendly country with which we are developing bilateral relations. We will continue to do so in an upward direction." Russian President Vladimir Putin reportedly plans to visit North Korea in the coming days, prompting some Western fears that Russia just might share nuclear technology with Pyongyang. Peskov said of these concerns, quote, "We believe that our right to develop good relations with our neighbors should not be of concern to anyone and cannot and should not be challenged by anyone."
Meanwhile, earlier this week, European Union officials announced that the EU will impose tariffs up to 38% on certain Chinese goods, including electric vehicles. When combined with the existing 10% tariff on the EU imposes on imported vehicles, Chinese suppliers could face up to 48% in tariffs. Experts later expressed concern that this could lead to a potential trade war with China. Chinese officials responded to the notice, saying the country would resolutely take all necessary measures to firmly defend the legitimate rights and interests of Chinese companies. The decision by the European Union came after a 9-month investigation into alleged unfair state subsidies for Chinese electric vehicles.
And before we go to break here, the International Energy Agency is predicting we may be heading towards a massive oil glut, citing a slowdown in demand and increasing supply. The agency's latest report predicts a global oil surplus by the year 2030. They noted advanced economies are moving toward alternative energy sources, while at the same time predicting that many non-OPEC countries will soon ramp up supply. The agency says all of this could lead to an excess supply never seen before, except maybe during the COVID-19 pandemic. All right, and as I said, we have more news coming up next, but first, let's go to a moment in history.
Welcome back to A Moment in History. I'm Seth Udinsky. I'd like to explore a legendary battle with you from the Middle Ages, if you don't mind, one of my favorite topics. Relatively unknown, it pitted a Crusader military order of knights against a small but mighty Eastern European Christian kingdom. Though the campaign began as a religious war, it could not be justified as one. As often took place in medieval Europe, Christians battled against other Christians for dominance, land, and power. This battle had all of that and a little bit more. Let's go back to the year 1410 and explore the Battle of Grunwald in Poland. Now, the two chief players in this battle each have a fascinating backstory. The first were the Order of Teutonic Knights, a military religious order founded in Jerusalem during the Crusades at the end of the 12th century. Unlike the Templars and the Hospitallers, who mainly focused their war efforts in the Holy Land and Latin Europe, the Teutonic Knights were recommissioned to the Baltic region by the Catholic Church with the charge of converting the pagan Slavic tribes of Eastern Europe to Christianity. But here's the key. At this point in history, much of Eastern Europe was already Christianized. This is where we meet the second of the players in the Battle of Grunwald, the Polish kingdom. Poland was Christianized way back in the 10th century AD. Several centuries later, in the late 1300s, the Kingdom of Poland merged with the small Duchy of Lithuania through marriage. In 1409, the powerful Teutonic Order declared war on this kingdom, even though they were already Christian. Now, the Battle of Grunwald would prove to be the most important war of the Teutonic-Polish clash. Polish soldiers attacked the Teutonic stronghold near the town of Grunwald on July 15, 1410. The Teutons were outnumbered, but still entered the fray, believing their superior discipline and skill on the battlefield would be enough to overcome the Slavic tribesmen. Well, it was not. After a failed attempt to use a cannon against the Polish knights, remember, gunpowder was very new at this time, and many cannons often misfired, backfired, or exploded in medieval warfare, the Teutons successfully charged the Poles, but were met with more manpower than they could handle. The Grand Master of the Order, a man by the name of Erlich von Juggingen, was killed in the battle. Now, Grunwald is still remembered as a day of celebration for Poland and Lithuania. Meanwhile, Grunwald marked the beginning of the end for the Teutonic Knights, who would never again hold the power they once did in Eastern Europe. Thanks so much for joining me once again for a moment in history.
Navigating through investment options can be challenging, especially when you're determined to uphold your God-given values. Every dollar you invest is a vote for the world that you want to live in. Let your values guide your investment decisions and help to shape the culture in which we live. Become a beacon of light and pave the way with biblically responsible investing. Timothy Plan, where faith and finance collide. Before investing, carefully consider the fund's investment objectives, risks, charges, and expenses of the investment company. This and other important information can be found in the fund's prospectus. To obtain a copy, visit timothyplan.com or call 800-846-7526. Read each prospectus carefully before investing. Investing involves risk, including the potential loss of principal.
But I felt very comfortable in that decision because I found a lot of support. Like, everyone here, like, always made sure, like, keep in contact with me. This is what ultimately changed my decision, you know, knowing that I had all this support that I didn't know I had. Now that he's here, he's 4 months old, like, I look at him and I honestly, like, it just makes me want to cry, like,
And welcome back once again to FISM News. I'm Samuel Case. We begin our segment now down in Florida, where parts of the Sunshine State aren't looking so sunny. In fact, they are actually underwater after record-setting rains. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis has declared a state of emergency for the southern part of the state, including Miami and Fort Lauderdale. It comes after the National Weather Service warned of life-threatening flooding. Yesterday was Fort Lauderdale's 8th wettest day on record after receiving 9.5 inches of rain. The storm forced two major airports to cancel over 600 flights in total. A flood warning will remain in effect through tomorrow for parts of the region, and residents are urged to stay off the road as they brace for another round of rain.
Meanwhile, in some other news, the Supreme Court has rejected the challenge that targeted the safety of chemical abortion pills. The court ruled unanimously that the doctors who wanted to restrict access to mifepristone did not have enough legal standing to sue the FDA. Though this is a victory for liberal lawmakers, conservative policy analysts say the fight is not over yet. Two senior legal fellows at the Heritage Foundation said in a statement, quote, "Today's decision is not the final judgment on the safety or effectiveness of mifepristone, which we know is unsafe for women and causes up to 1 in 22 women to end up in the emergency room. While legal technicalities might allow Biden's FDA to continue manipulating its safety rules to push a pro-abortion agenda at the expense of health and common sense, women and girls taking these chemical abortion drugs are still in danger and largely left to fend for themselves." They added, quote, "Policymakers should be, at a minimum, demanding that the FDA follow its own original safety guidelines, not give abortion drugs a pass because of radical abortion ideology."
But on the flip side, we did see a major win down in Texas for conservatives. This week, a federal judge said Texas can ignore one of President Biden's new LGBT protections under Title IX. In his ruling, Judge Reed O'Connor said the Biden administration overstepped its authority by pushing what he called an agenda wholly divorced from the text, structure, and contemporary context of Title IX. Back in 2021, the Biden administration issued new guidelines barring discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. Those guidelines were not legally binding, but could affect federal funding for schools. Judge O'Connor said they were functionally rewriting Title IX in a way that shockingly transforms American education and also usurps a major question from Congress. This case, it should be noted, is separate from the Biden administration's regulations issued back in April. Those explicitly ban schools from discriminating against LGBT students. This ruling, though, will likely play a rather important role in future Title IX litigations.
And speaking of Title IX, despite the Olympics coming out in support of transgender athletes, trans swimmer Leah Thomas will not be competing in the Paris Olympic Games. Leah Thomas, who used to be known as William Thomas before his female hormone therapy, lost a lawsuit alleging that the Olympic Committee unfairly discriminated against him. The male athlete began dominating women's swimming events after he had started identifying as a female. He was the first trans athlete to win the NCAA Division I title in 2022. Much outrage followed the incident, with then college athlete Riley Gaines coming forward to criticize Thomas. She also filed a lawsuit against the NCAA. Most recently, she celebrated Thomas's ban from the Olympics, saying, quote, "Great news, Leah Thomas will not be competing in the women's category at the Olympics or any other elite competition. This is a victory for women and girls everywhere."
And we end on some really good news. That is, more states are looking to put chaplains back in schools. 17 of them have already proposed or passed measures allowing chaplains. One of them, of course, is Florida. Here's Florida Governor Ron DeSantis touting the benefits of this program.
You know, you got a lot of these problems that kids go through. You know, there's some students where, you know, they need some soul craft. And that can make all the difference in the world. And so these chaplains will be able to come and provide services.
It's really an incredible thing. It's a good thing, too. 17 states, and this comes at a time where students are desperately in need of mental health assistance, which schools are sorely lacking right now.
Yes, absolutely. All right, well, that's our program for today. Thank you so much for joining us, and please visit FISMnews.tv for more content.
And for more updates until our next show, you can check us out on social media or by downloading the FISM app. Thanks so much, and we'll see you tomorrow with more news coverage.